Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. I am Scott Bevan coming to you live from Glasgow. We are joined today by regular contributor Siobhan Toland. Hello, Siobhan.
Hi, how you doing?
Yes, not too bad.
You're the first person to get my name right as well, so well done.
Well, first then with the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,394,702 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,063,851 have been confirmed negative. 330,851 people have tested positive. There are 1,464 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test. Although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 7,800. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 536 were in hospital last night, 45 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 am this morning, 3,981,950 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,978,746 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 128,727 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 19 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. Today we are also seeing the first concrete news on vaccinations for those under 18. In line with the Joint Committee on Vaccinations advice, young people aged between 12 and 15 with underlying health conditions or who are household contacts of people who are immunosuppressed will now be eligible for and offered a COVID-19 vaccination. So until now there has been no plans released to vaccinate under 18s, Siobhan. So this is the first, isn't it? Why is it only from 12?
My understanding is that the testing was done for older kids, and obviously there's a balance between the risk of the vaccination or the risk that the vaccination brings and the risk that COVID brings to kids. So of course, the younger you are, the less symptoms you tend to have generally across the board. But I noticed as well that what you were just saying there was vulnerable kids or kids in vulnerable families rather, which is just stupidly rather dawned on me that my son would qualify then, which takes maybe a bit of ease off as well. So in that respect, it's a trade-off between harems, isn't it? And of course, especially for vulnerable kids or kids in vulnerable families, then it's a very good trade-off because it offers much more protection. In fact, I was just literally catching up on the Indie Sage podcast. This is the English response, of course, and they're quite upset that vulnerable kids didn't look like they're going to get vaccinated in England. So it's a very different response in Scotland, a much better response, a much safer response.
Well, to our top story for today then. The SNP have called for a stop to what they have described as the hateful anti-refugee bill. The SNP have taken action to stop the Tories' hateful anti-refugee bill in its tracks, which is set to punish vulnerable people and refugees seeking asylum. The Nationality and Borders Bill, set to receive its second reading today, will strip many refugees of rights to family reunion, support and to settle permanently, as well as criminalise many who seeking protection in the UK, with sentences of up to 4 years. It could also see accommodations such as the Napier and Penally detention sites become the norm. The SNP's Home Affairs spokesperson Stuart MacDonald MP has tabled a reasoned amendment that declines to give the bill a second reading. The bill has been widely criticised by MPs and refugee charities, including the Scottish Refugee Council, who stated that it does not offer the humane system that we need. and charity Families Together, who stated the proposals pose a huge threat to refugee protection across the UK. Speaking ahead of the debate today, the SNP Shadow Home Secretary Stuart MacDonald said the Tory government's Nationality and Borders Bill is nothing more than a hateful anti-refugee bill that breaches the UK's international obligations. It must be condemned in the strongest possible manner. By sticking by this bill, Priti Patel is defending criminalising torture victims, victims of war crimes, persecuted Christian converts and other refugees for seeking our protection. MPs and charities alike have expressed serious concerns about the bill, but the Tories have ignored them and are ploughing ahead with it anyway. So, Siobhan, this is the sort of thing that during the EU referendum, anti-Brexit campaigners were saying might happen, and the Vote Leave were saying that's Project Fear, you're talking nonsense, it's never going to happen. Does this now confirm that a lot of the fears that were brought up then are now being realised? In fact, some worse than some of the things that were brought up at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that even in the 2014 referendum, we were kind of accused as scaremongering for saying that certain things might happen. The tone and the rhetoric of the Brexit campaign from those in charge was founded on racism and a deliberate attempt to exclude. Even if you look at Nigel Farage's poster, had nothing to do with the EU. What it had to do with was kind of non-white people coming into the country. So there was massive racial undertones. That's not to say that people who voted Brexit were automatically racist, but it's a criticism of the campaign that was created across the board that was funded on a fundamental racism. And I think that what Brexit did was facilitate that shift to the right that allowed that racism to happen. I mean, the SNP's challenge is an interesting one because what it's doing is it's using the UN Convention on the status of refugees to try and counteract it. It's bringing in united national, international ethics to try and prevent something that is deeply, deeply unsettling and deeply, deeply racist, actually, and criminalising people, criminalising vulnerable people just for trying to get away from trauma, abuse, violence, state subjugated violence as well. We really are in a kind of talk about crossing the Rubicon in terms of morality and in terms of international solidarity. We really have crossed there, to get into a situation where organisations like the Royal National Lifeboat Institution saying, do you know what, we don't care what you're going to say, we're going to save lives anyway. It really is quite a standoff there in terms of our kind of morality and ethics as well. It's a sad day. It's a sad day, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what the SNP amendment does. It's unfortunately unlikely, but good for the SNP for introducing it, and good for the SNP for trying to stop it. We'll see what the Labour Party says as well. We'll see what the Labour Party does with this. Sometimes you wonder that their hatred of the SNP overshadows so much. It can overshadow sense of common justice sometimes. So I'll be interested to see what the Labour Party's response to this might be.
Yeah, the vote will be happening now, as I understand it.
Yeah.
You mentioned Nigel Farage there. A lot of the rhetoric that Nigel Farage espoused during that campaign has been taken as Tory policy, really, hasn't it? And of course, Nigel Farage is not an MP, he was not an official part of the Vote Leave campaign. So why is his voice the one that has sort of cut through in the Brexit narrative?
Because he was given the power to do so. He was given the airwaves, he was given the status, he was given the gravitas across the media and across government as well. He was given power far above his individual voice. He was on the telly all the goddamn time at that point. You'll seem to remember. He was given much more power than he should have done. Because actually what that done is he represented a shift in the kind of foundations of Westminster and in the foundations of the kind of UK state. He represented a voice there that had been silent and a wee bit kind of underground for quite so long. So he came and he was facilitated by very many people in power. He's also a damn good PR guy. Whatever you think of him, he knows how to run a good PR campaign. And what he did, of course, was shift the ideological boundaries that the Conservatives, or parts of the Conservative Party, were a bit scared to do, but it emboldened the extreme right that was existing within the party. Nigel Farage didn't need to be in the party to change the party because, like you say, they shifted in his direction anyway. So he was given much more power because he represented a deeper power that was sitting there waiting to go. That's what I think happened. You look at the split in the Conservative Party, and during that Brexit mess, there really was a kind of a traditional conservatism within the party. John Bercow was a good example of that. Then you looked at the extreme right that was kind of trying to take over, the Rees-Moggs, the Goves, the Boris Johnson, who's an opportunist at best, I suppose. There really was a kind of struggle for control within the party. And unfortunately, the kind of traditional Conservatives they no longer sought election after all the debacle, and the right managed to take over in the same way that the Trumpian right has taken over the Republican Party. We forget sometimes that it's not a unified party. The right has taken over. The Conservative Party in the 1950s was more akin to Labour over the last couple of decades than the Conservatives. But yeah, the right has taken over, and Nigel Farage managed to do it outside the party, but because he had so much support within the party.
Yeah. Well, if the Conservative Party then think that these anti-immigration, far-right legislation laws are the ones that the people want, why do you think that is, and do you think that's true? That is what the people of the UK have voted for in Brexit?
I'm not. No, I'm not necessarily sure the Conservative government care what the people want. I think they use the people as an excuse to fuel kind of right wing ideology. David Cameron did it. Oh well, the people have spoken. It's funny how the people have spoken when it's only something relatively right wing, and that was in relation to the refugee crisis that you said that way back then, as well. I think that the ideology, I think, is much more complicated because what you've got is it's very easy to whip a population up into hatred. We know that from our history, how easy it could actually be, how easily we could scare people into believing there's a mythical enemy out there that's ready to attack us at any point in time. And the fear of the foreigner is something that goes across history and across nationalities as well. So it's quite easy to whip up that fear. That doesn't necessarily mean that the people want it. It means that sometimes the people are in a state of fear, they're not quite sure. It's the traditional folk devil, really, isn't it? That states and political structures will set up in order to control the population, to hierarchize the population. So we're just grateful for the little crumbs that we've had. And at least we're better off than those down below us. And that's kind of how the hierarchy often works. I think in the main that people tend to repeat a rhetoric, but when you ask them one-to-one on an individual humane basis, would you really, really see a person in the street? You know what I mean? Then the humanity takes over. But sometimes rhetoric never really fits in with the actual lived experience. Sometimes we know that through conspiracy theory. It doesn't often meet our lived realities. We repeat rhetoric. I mean, I've heard people talking about benefit scroungers when their sister's on benefits. Do you know what I mean? That's what I mean. It's like you repeat the rhetoric, you don't quite connect it to your lived experience and the lived reality. And I think you have that with race and racism. And I think that what you've got is the Nigel Farage and those that embolden them, they whipped up that racism and get people into a frenzy. That's how you begin to divide people, because when they're fighting at each other's throats and they're seeing themselves as superior to X, Y, and Z, they're actually forgetting that there's the problem. Do you remember back in 2010 or so, after the kind of crisis, it was a common sense understanding that the crisis was the bankers' fault. Everybody knew that.
Yeah.
Everybody spoke about that very openly and honestly, and that was the truth that we held at that moment in time. Well, within like 3, 4, 5 years, suddenly the rhetoric changed and it's all about the foreigners. There's a strategy there, there's a structure there that it's basically classic deflection, and it uses the divide and rule to keep those in power. We no longer talk about that now. We talk about Europe, we talk about the asylum seekers, because this is what's happening. So it's classic deflection in a very, very sinister way. History tends to do that. I was watching a documentary on the history of America at one point, and they were saying every economic crash, what you get is that cultural backlash against the foreigner. So it's not uncommon for that to happen.
Yeah, on the topic of anti-immigration legislation then, a Spanish woman who has lived in the UK for 44 years has been sacked over Brexit rules. The woman in question, who arrived in England as an 11-month-old baby, has never left the country and has been sacked from her job in a care home because she is unable to prove that she has the right to work in the UK, in a case illustrating the difficulties experienced by EU nationals as employers grapple with post-Brexit right-to-work regulations. She said she has tried more than 100 times to get through to the Home Office run helpline in the past 3 weeks, but has never been able to speak to an advisor. She has applied for EU settled status, but her application is stuck somewhere in the backlog of over 500,000 cases the Home Office has yet to process. She is the main breadwinner for her family with 2 children to support, and said that her dismissal has left her struggling to buy food. Charities helping EU nationals say the case is not unique. Dora Olivia Vikol, CEO of the Work Rights Centre, said, "We've seen this time and again when people with pending EU SS applications were asked to take unpaid leave or were turned down from employment." She had been aware that she might need to apply for EU settled status, having seen government advertisements, but was unsure about how to apply because she had no passport. So, Siobhan, this is highlighting some of the things that we've just been talking about, but people who were unable to apply for settled status or were able to apply for settled status but just weren't sure how to go about it. This is something that's quite common, isn't it? And we're going to see thousands of these cases surely over the next few months.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is your kind of hostile environment moving into European circles now, isn't it? I mean, we've increasingly, I mean, we talked about Brexit and we talked about, the kind of the fear mongering against asylum seekers and stuff, but the rhetoric against Europe has been quite significant and quite fierce as well by the government in order to justify breaking away from the European Union, and people are fodder in that struggle. Unfortunately, what we've got is it's not just recklessness. It's not even, it's just it's awful. The fear, the worry, if you think about that woman's case and you times that by 500,000, because that's what their backlog is, you've got a lot of worried, stressed, oppressed people that are basically unsure what's going to happen now. What was it the woman says, that she's the main breadwinner, she's got 2 kids, she's lost her job and now she's struggling to buy food. That's kind of, I mean, that is deliberate disempowerment of our citizens. It really is quite shocking, and it's all part of the same process that dehumanises certain groups of people in order to create a white superiority. This is what the extreme right do. So what you've got here is yet another layer of that dehumanisation, but what's happening now, it's the European citizens that have become part of that. It's unacceptable. We know through our our political situation in Scotland. It's something that we never wanted. It's something that we'll never accept. And it really is, again, it shows you that massive chasm now between the UK Westminster structure and the Scottish structure, because this is not something that we would never vote in a government that does this, or we haven't voted in any government that's done this over the last decade, and especially since Brexit. It really is kind of difficult times now. Do you think the UK government's going to go, oh no, there's a backlog, do you think we'll fix it? I think this is a kind of deliberate strategy almost, isn't it? It's just like, because they don't care enough in order to resolve these problems. That's the issue, because these people have no humanity as far as the government are concerned. You don't allow that to happen if you care about your citizens. That's
Yeah.
just how it works.
Well, this case in question, the lady was called on the 28th of June to a meeting because managers discovered that she had no documentation proving the right to work in the UK. And then on the 30th, she applied for EU settled status, which was obviously just before the deadline. But she wasn't sure how she could do that because she didn't have a British passport. She'd also never had a Spanish passport. She'd been here since she was 11 months old. You know, so it raises a couple of questions. One is firstly, what makes someone a nationality? So what makes someone British, Spanish, whatever? You know, and the second one is that, I mean, she couldn't get through to anyone on the phone and had to do it all via email. Are we relying too much on technology for all of this?
I think we're relying too much on inhumanity for all of it. But yes, I think you're partly right as well. The technology. I mean, can you imagine, you know, the fate of your future is in the hands of kind of random emails that you have to do. I know that phone calls are difficult in COVID times. You know, in my work, you know, nobody can phone me now, and I can't phone the organisations I need to phone. So there is an element there, but at the same time, you know, we can anticipate that. But yeah, it's technology run by quite a heartless system, I think, combined. The worry and the fear of that poor woman, you know, that's just, you know, and the way she was treated by her work as well. You know, I mean, I would like to think that my work would kind of sit me down and say, do you know what? We're going to help you with this, you know. And you know what? My work did do this. They did Q&A sessions with the European workforce within, because I work in a large institution, so they did Q&A sessions. They constantly kept European citizens up to date. I know that because we've got a couple in my office, and so there was a kind of sense of support and solidarity, I think, with the workforce there. But here it seems it was quite a harsh, I'm sorry, where are you going? You know, no understanding of that woman's history. Your first question, which I'll answer now, is, you know, what makes a nationality? Well, this is where Scotland is different. Is that you live here, you're Scottish. That, you know, and that could be 11 months, or it could be, you know, from what was it, 44 years this woman's been here. Why would you even think that you would need a passport? Why would you think you would need evidence? You know?
Do you think that that is a difference then between a Scottish perspective and a perspective that's perhaps shared in other parts of the UK? That people in Scotland do think if you live here and you want to be Scottish, then you're Scottish and it doesn't matter anyway. Whereas perhaps you're suggesting in the rest of the UK that's not the way that people look at it.
I think, I mean, it's not quite as kind of black and white as that, I suppose, but I do think that there is a Scottish flavour there. And I also think probably more importantly is that we have a government that reflects that. So the power structures reflect a much more egalitarian and a much more libertarian way of looking at it, or a liberatory way of looking at it. So unfortunately for England, and that comes back to my previous point, that it's not quite a case of, you know, the people dictate the government. The government can also often dictate the ideology that the people follow. And what you've got in England especially is a government that's building up, you know, a harsh, shocking and inhumane system, whereas in Scotland the power structure is different. That's not to say there isn't racists in Scotland. That's not to say you don't get go home now rhetoric that kind of that flits around the edges, but their voice has very little power within the Scottish political structure. Whereas in England, unfortunately, they've gained a lot of power, and I think that can change the tone and culture of society quite easily, as we've seen. We wouldn't be having this conversation 10 years ago.
Mm. Well, the UK is under fire over a 69 pence a minute EU helpline. The government has come under fire after introducing a 69 pence a minute charge for a helpline for EU citizens who are trying to prove to landlords or employers that they have the right to remain in the country after Brexit. Callers to the View and Prove Immigration Status telephone number 0300 790 6268 must also pre-authorise a potential £5 credit on a bank card before talking to an assistant. Campaigners at the 3 Million Group have now written to the future Borders and Immigration Minister Kevin Foster to protest against charges that amount to £10.35 for 15 minutes of assistance. They say the charges are contrary to the assurances given in the High Court recently and are causing a lot of distress. The activist groups failed in its court application earlier this year to force the government to issue EU citizens a physical document to prove their right to work and live in the UK after Brexit. However, at the hearing, the Home Office told the judge that the defendant will not charge for calls. Under the post-Brexit system, the Home Office generates shared codes that last for 30 days to allow EU citizens evidence of their right to rent or work in the UK. But the 3 Million says it is concerned that the helpline is needed by those who are not digitally literate and those who are confronted with technical glitches trying to prove their status in the first place. This comes back to really what we were just saying, that, I mean, even when you can get through to the correct helpline, you're getting charged for it, and you have to prove that you already have money in the bank before you can even speak to people. I mean, that's something that, I mean, I'm thinking here, you know, if I had to call them, for instance, not that I will, but, you know, that's the thing, because I was born in this country, I don't have to, and that's awful. But, you know, if I did have to, I wouldn't be able to get through to anyone because they check my bank balance, say, oh, you're in your overdraft, okay, you can't speak to anyone.
Yeah. I mean, hands up. How many times have we not had £5 in credit in our bank account? How many times can we not afford a tenner for 15 minutes of assistance? You know, and this is just me, quite a lot, I would say, throughout my life. Even recently, I'm into my overdraft. You know what I mean? This is the thing. This is a lot of money for some people, and what the projected image here is basically, you know, you can prove it, but only if you have that £10 odds in your bank account, or only have that £5 credit in order to prove. So you need money. So this is a kind of anti-poor thing as well. You know, you can prove it as long as you have some money. Now, for some people, it might not seem a lot, but we have masses of poverty across the UK and within Scotland, and it's getting worse by the week. Masses of poverty. A fiver is everything to some people. It is the difference between feeding someone, having a meal, or not having a meal. So there you go. These are the choices. That's the reality of the choices that some people have to make. I mean, I'm working for Taught by Mohammed Food Bank at the moment as well, and that's what you've got. You've got people that are using the food bank. Now, how do they afford that? Well, they can't. That's the point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very dangerous situation that we're in, and thank you very much for enlightening us on some of that and some of the reasons that you think we are where we are today with this. Moving on then, the UK government are threatening to deviate from their Brexit deal on Northern Ireland. Reuters are reporting that the UK government will threaten to deviate from the Brexit deal this week unless the European Union shows more flexibility over Northern Ireland. Deviating from the Northern Ireland Protocol is a risky step. Its aim was to prevent Brexit from disrupting the delicate peace brought to Northern Ireland by the US brokered 1998 peace deal that ended 3 decades of sectarian conflict. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who signed the 2020 Brexit deal, has been dismayed by the protocol, which has imposed paperwork and checks that London says could prevent British food staples such as sausages going to Northern Ireland. David Frost, the Tory minister who leads Brexit negotiations, is preparing to announce a significant potential change to the protocol that could have far-reaching consequences for the relationship with the EU, one of the sources said. Mr Frost is due to update Parliament on Wednesday about Northern Ireland and will also present a paper on Brexit. Brussels expects Frost will push for a deviation from the protocols unless the EU agrees to compromise, said an EU diplomat who was briefed on talks with British negotiators. So we're in a situation now where Boris Johnson and the Westminster government are saying that Brexit is done. But is it?
Oh God, I don't know how many times this has come up on the shows, and it keeps coming back again and again. And in a kind of slightly kind of bizarre Monty Python-esque way of looking at it, you've got this situation where basically the UK are saying, we're going to come out the deal. We're going to come out the deal. We're going to come out the deal. And it's a bit like, it's just like your friend that keeps threatening to do something. And it's like, oh, either do it or shut up. You know what I mean? So we've got this kind of constant back and forth. But here's what's interesting. David Frost says that 50-50 public support is not enough to implement fundamental changes. But, Brexit was okay on something like 54%. It was even better when it was 60% in Scotland have voted against Brexit. That's okay to initiate fundamental change, but 50-50 public support within Northern Ireland isn't. I mean, no one's surprised that there's going to be this. I'll be interested to see what the Brexit legislation says. No one's surprised that Britain is doing this, because they've been chomping at the bit to change this ever since they realised that it wasn't the best deal, because they never read the small print. Do you know what I mean? So we've got a situation that's just I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so serious. We really have this kind of quite bizarre situation where the UK have basically signed an agreement, and now they're going to say, well, do you know what? We didn't really like that agreement anymore. On what planet, internationally, can a country think it's okay to do that? I mean, it just breaks all established good practice and good protocol on an international stage. And if you combine what they're doing with the Freedom Day, which has the international scientific community absolutely agog in shock and horror, we're looking at a situation where the international community are just looking at the UK going, oh my God, what are they doing? What are they willing to sacrifice for this extraordinarily narrow political agenda that they seem to have? To sacrifice the peace process is extraordinarily reckless. I don't know how many times I've said that, because this issue constantly raises its head now. And you know what's going to happen. You can see the MO. They're going to start. They'll soon start a kind of massive anti-EU campaign across the media in order to justify the changes that they're about to make, or the breaking of the agreement that it looks like they're about to make. It's shocking that the uncertainty and the insecurity and the threat to peace that Northern Ireland are experiencing as a result of these actions is extraordinary. And do you ever? I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but every day now you seem to kind of your chin just drops that little bit more when you're watching Westminster, going, is this for real? Am I dreaming this? Because it seems so outrageously reckless in what it's doing. It's extraordinarily Trumpian. It's taken off with Trump left, actually.
What is it about trade deals around sausages and stuff that puts the protocols in the Northern Ireland peace process under threat? What is it that that makes that dangerous?
I mean, I think that kind of stuff to me is just a red herring. I think they're picking something out of a hat in order to justify kind of going back on the deals. I mean, the UK could have had a deal if they'd agreed to the food standards that the European Union had. Now that was an option that they rejected, and it shows you, I think, that it was all really about rhetoric, because they say no, we want high food standards, but there's the rub, isn't it? It's like they could have had a deal. They could have had a deal that everybody kind of was relatively okay with, but they decided not to do that, and then they decided to push down this road, and then suddenly the paperwork becomes overwhelming, and suddenly there's a border in the middle of the the sea, which they knew was going to happen. I do think that it's the same way, I think, that Westminster deal with COVID. They want everybody to bend to their will. And that includes, I think that I think they think that COVID's going to bend to their will as well. It's a very empire-esque, I think, way of thinking, that they shouldn't need to compromise, but everybody else should. I also think that there's obviously there's a shift in the DUP now. There's a kind of a bit more of a shift to the right in terms of the new leadership or the mess that's been created there as well. So there's probably pressure within the unionist circles too. So it's quite it's a messy business. I think that when you're desperate for a trade deal, I mean, we saw this with Theresa May back with Donald Trump when there was this kind of weird, borderline creepy kind of thing going on there that, we would do anything for a trade deal here. And there is an element here that, they have to break that in order to lower their standards across the board in order to get the trade deals anywhere else. If you look at the Australian trade deal and what the UK is willing to sacrifice in terms of standards and animal welfare and well-being and so forth, there's a desperation there, and it's a race to the bottom. It's a race to the bottom in terms of trade, in terms of wages, and in terms of rights.
Yeah, well, they gave up the food standards so that they could have a trade deal with America, as you say, didn't they? And does that sort of characterise the discussions around Brexit and the mindset around the Tories and around Brexit, that they were giving up Europe for America? Is that essentially what a lot of people were thinking there, do you think?
I think there was an element of that, in the sense that America is ideologically offered a very different structure. It offered, less holidays, less workers' rights, lower standards of food. It allowed the UK to break from, I think, quite a traditionally high standard of workers' rights and trade and the social contract, I think, that Europe and European countries tend to have. So that shift to the right-wing economics, where there's very few rights and everything is done on a kind of a laissez-faire free market policy, then yes, I think they do. I don't think it was quite, let's look to America, but America was the beacon for that. That's slightly changed now, though. Biden's kind of changing that culture. Do
you think that he is?
So they're in a bit of a pickle. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've seen, I mean, you mentioned Freedom Day earlier, and we've seen that that's what's happening in England today.
For sure.
But moving on, a potential global abuse of Pegasus cyber surveillance hacking software has been exposed. Human rights activists, journalists, and lawyers across the world have allegedly been targeted by authoritarian governments using hacking software sold by the Israeli surveillance company NSO Group, according to an investigation into a massive data leak. The investigation by The Guardian and 16 other media organisations suggests widespread and continuing abuse of NSO's hacking spyware Pegasus, which the company insists is only intended for use against criminals and terrorists. Pegasus is a malware that infects iPhones and Android devices to enable operators of the tool to extract messages, photos, and emails, record calls, and secretly activate microphones. The leak contains a list of more than 50,000 phone numbers that, it is believed, have been identified as those of people of interest by clients of NSO since 2016. Forbidden Stories, a Paris-based non-profit media organisation, and Amnesty International initially had access to the leaked list and shared access with media partners as part of a reporting consortium. The presence of a phone number in the data does not reveal whether a device was infected, but with Pegasus or subject to an attempted hack. However, the consortium believes that the data is indicative of the potential targets NSO's government clients have identified in advance of possible surveillance attempts. Forensic analysis of a small number of phones whose numbers appeared on the leaked list also showed more than half did still possess traces of the Pegasus spyware. The Guardian and its media partners will be revealing the identities of people whose number appeared on the list in the coming days. They include hundreds of business executives, religious figures, academics, NGO employees, union officials, and government officials, including cabinet ministers, presidents, and prime ministers. The list also contains a number of members of the Saudi Arabian royal family, suggesting that the ruler may have instructed their intelligence agencies to explore the possibility of monitoring their own relatives. This spyware then is something that we've heard quite
Indeed.
a lot of over the past sort of 10 years, ever since Edward Snowden and Julian Assange,
Yeah.
etc.,
Hmm.
raised these through WikiLeaks. It's not
Hmm.
going away, is it?
No, it doesn't look like it, and it looks like they're doing it across the board now as well. I question the language that it's an abuse, if I'm honest. And I know that the organisation said, "Oh, we had nothing to do with it. We only sell it on good faith." But I'm not necessarily sure it's an abuse. I'm pretty sure that's what it was designed for, in the first place. We always justify these things. Hannah Arendt talks about this in the origins of totalitarianism. She says that the way you begin to justify the infringement of rights is you start with a group of people that people think, yeah, that's probably justified. They were bad people. So, this software was only really used for terrorists. Well, they're bad people. They deserve to be spied on. Well, it's only really for criminals. Well, they're bad people. They deserve to kind of be spied on. And then suddenly what you've got is this creeping into ordinary everyday world. And then the next thing you know, everybody's been spied on, as this seems. I know that it's just a small analysis, but they said over half what they've analysed had traces of that spyware. So
Yeah.
180 journalists are on the list. So if you extrapolate that, you're talking over 90, almost 100 journalists, including things like the New York Times, France 24, the Economist, Reuters, even. So you've
Mm.
got this kind of quite insidious situation where this software is now being used across the board. And what is it? It's like a virus, isn't it? It just feeds into your phone and then starts kind of picking up all these messages. So it's quite an insidious thing. And it is fundamentally anti-democratic across the board. Fundamentally, you don't spy on political leaders or a political opposition. You don't spy on your journalists. There are lines here again, the Rubicon lines that we have crossed quite significantly. The upside of this, I think, is that this for me was an example of great journalism and great advancement for democratic rights. It was an incredible investigation, and it's still going on. They're going to begin to release some of the names actually that have been spied on, but it's a good investigation, and it's an important investigation to bring back and reintegrate basic democratic rights across the board. So good on the organisations and all the media organisations and Amnesty International for doing that. But it's not a surprise. This is the thing. We read it and you go, oh,
Yeah.
that's old an old story. Like you were saying, we knew this 10 years ago. But it all comes out, doesn't it? And it's just become so normalised now, actually, enough to make one very paranoid, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, lots of people are being spied on whom you wouldn't usually think would be the subject of
Yeah,
spying. It's part of the sort of mass surveillance culture, isn't it? But there's been this sort of
yeah.
stuff going on for decades. I mean, through the Cold War, right the way
Yeah.
through. What is the difference between now, the sort of spying that's going on now,
Mm.
and the spying that was going on, 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? It's much easier now. We give most of our information away. We tell everybody on social media where we are
Mm,
24/7 these days. So we do a lot of the work for them. I think that because of the ease of it as well, then it means that more people can be spied on. It was, 30, 40 years ago, a lot of legwork. Um, but in the main, you've still got that same ideology where they justify the enemy in order to spy on our domestic partners, in order to spy on ordinary everyday people. So the principle probably remains the same. It's probably more the ease by which companies can now do that. It's incredibly easy just to kind of, I mean, that's all it takes is a wee virus now. Whereas before it would have taken four MI5 officers years or months of good hard work to spy on people. So it has become much easier now, and I think to a certain extent it's become much more normalised as well. And I think that's what makes it dangerous because, I mean, when I read it, honestly, it was like almost a wee shrug of your shoulders to think, God, right, okay, because it is so normal. It's shocking. It's genuinely shocking. But because it's happening so often now, we kind of feel that it is just less shocking because it's happening so often. I think as well that the Cold War or this kind of enemy camp often justified it, whereas the enemy lie in lots of different terrain now. So it opens up the terrain, I think, and the scope for spying, I think, much more as well. There is also a lot of powers that are much more uncheckered now in terms of governments, that allows them the power to do that too.
Mm. Well, thank you very much for that, Siobhan. 170 people are still missing around Koblenz in Germany as victim numbers set to rise. About 170 people are still listed as missing in the area of Western Germany hardest hit by deadly flooding. Koblenz Deputy Police Chief Jürgen Swiss said on Monday, adding the number of victims would surely rise. German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer has rejected criticism that the government had failed to sufficiently warn people of last week's floods, as the confirmed death toll from the country's worst natural disaster in almost 6 decades rose above 160. Flooding has devastated parts of Western Europe since last Wednesday, with the German states of Rhineland-Palatinate and North Rhine-Westphalia, as well as parts of Belgium, among the worst hit. In the Ahrweiler district south of Cologne, at least 117 people were killed, and police warned that the death toll would almost certainly rise as the cleanup continues from floods whose costs may run as high as €3 billion. The high death toll has raised questions around why so many people seem to have been surprised by the flash flooding, with opposition politicians suggesting the death toll reveals serious failings in Germany's flood preparedness. Seehofer said in response that the German National Meteorological Service, DWD, issues warnings to Germany's 16 states and from there to districts and communities that decide at a local level how to respond. Siobhan, are the national government in Germany sort of trying to wash their hands of this a little bit and saying that the states knew and so it was up to them to do something about it rather than admit there might have been failings?
Maybe, Germany is quite a devolved nation. The states have quite a lot of devolved power. So there's a lot that does fall within the remit. The federal government doesn't quite have that. I think that, the severity of this flooding has surprised even the climate scientists, as well. So, we have a situation where, it wasn't just, the German government that came as a surprise. That, even climate scientists are saying, oh, this is kind of happening much worse and much faster than what we thought. I don't know enough to know whether there was mistakes or errors made. It's a difficult one. It's what I did pick up on, which was I think was probably the most potent and powerful quote I've heard in terms of global warming, is that the ARD public television, Germany's ARD public television company, said the weather is political. 10, 20 years ago it was trivial, and now the weather is political, and so everything to do with the weather has political ramifications now, and that's something maybe to think about as we go. We've got the COP conference in November, and I would hope that Germany would be kind of much more strident in trying to kind of tackle climate change now. Give Germany its due. They were moving towards nuclear power, and then Fukushima happened, and then they stopped, and they're now on a phased removal of nuclear power, and they move towards renewables. So they do have a history of changing according to the circumstances.
Well, we just need to hope that there aren't more floods over the course of the summer.
Well, there will
Moving
be,
on now. Yeah. Moving on now to the NHS Louisa Jordan, which has now closed. The NHS Louisa Jordan, established to help ensure NHS Scotland had extra capacity to treat patients during the COVID-19 pandemic, has now closed to all patients. The final closure announcement means that all NHS services will now end in order to convert the SEC back into an events venue for COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference. NHS Louisa Jordan was constructed in the Scottish Events Campus SEC and stood ready to accept patients from the 20th of April 2020. Thanks to the public's continued efforts to reduce the spread of the virus, the NHS Louisa Jordan was not required to treat COVID inpatients. Since July of 2020, however, the hospital played a crucial role in supporting the remobilisation of NHS Scotland, carrying out 32,000 healthcare appointments and training more than 6,900 healthcare staff and students. Additionally, the site supported the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service, providing facilities for more than 500 donations to be made. The NHS Louisa Jordan site will have also undertaken over 370,000 vaccines to members of the public, as well as health and social care staff. Is this the right time for us to be closing this then, Siobhan, now that we are starting to open things up again? We are on level 0 and hopefully by August the 9th we'll be back to pre-pandemic levels almost. Is that the time to be closing this, or should we maybe be holding off? How long does it take to set up for the COP26 conference?
Yeah. I mean, I hope that this is the right decision. I remember when they spoke about it and when it was kind of getting built, it was an incredibly scary time for us all back then, and the images that we had of what Louisa Jordan could be or could become at that time was actually pretty terrifying, kind of bodies building up in hospital wards and stuff. And that was certainly the concern that we had way back then, in the early days of the pandemic. Thank God we had it, though. It was a good call, even though it wasn't used for its original purpose. It did get used to bolster the NHS at a time of acute tension on the health service at the time. So far, the vaccination is allowing us to prevent masses of hospitalisations, but there is pressure on the NHS, and it's not, I think I said this in the last programme, it's not necessarily that we're getting hordes and hordes of people coming in sick, although we are, but certainly not to the extent of this time last year. What it is a lot of staff are off sick because they're all in isolation, so there's kind of, there's the other side of it that's causing a kind of a strain on the services as well. So I hope this is the right decision. It means that, there's a move forward here. It would be disastrous for us if this was closing in 2, 3, 4 weeks or even months down the line, we're needing it again. That would be a massive, massive step backward for Scotland and the globe, actually, because it would suggest there's no way it's under control. So I'm kind of going to be positive and see this as a good news story.
Right. Yeah.
That maybe we're finding a way forward here, and the vaccination is holding, and maybe once we kind of start the vaccination program with some of the kids, then we can kind of move forward a bit better as well.
Yeah, but that's a really good point, isn't it? That we could potentially be back here in 5, 6 weeks' time. As you mentioned, I mean, we hope we hope we won't be. Hopefully, it will be August 9th, and we'll be back to pre-pandemic levels. It's happening today in England, but the Delta variant has increased the likelihood of things like that happening. So, I mean, we've already seen, protests in England, even on the day they're opening things back up. So, what's the chances that we could be back here, do you think?
Do you know what? That's the problem, isn't it? That it's so hard to predict. And the cases in Scotland are falling. They come from a phenomenally high figure. But I suspect, and watching Independent Sage earlier on, that I'm suspecting the same as them, that it's because the schools are off, actually, so it's not quite got the COVID breeding ground as it had. So, maybe when the schools go back, that'll be a test for us. I mean, the good news is that according to the science is that now that we've got a vaccine, it's unlikely that we'll find a variant that is so far removed from the vaccine that the vaccine won't have any impact at all. So we've kind of crossed that bridge. It's unlikely. Most viruses will never go back in the sense that where we were like March, April, May, June, July 2020. So in that respect, we have moved forward quite a lot. The vaccine is helping. It's not helping spread, but it's helping reduce the symptoms, and that's one of the things that is quite important. The problem we have, though, is that it is so unknown, and it is a brand new virus as far as we're concerned. And even the scientists are disagreeing with X, Y, and Z. So it's a very, very difficult thing to know. The procedure, of course, is if you don't know things, then you move with caution. And that's where the difference between Scotland and England is. What we've got is a kind of like literally an agog recklessness down south. My sister says now it's Freedom Day. She's in England, that she's off out clubbing tonight. So, so but it's hard to know. It's an unknown, and that's maybe what's scary about it, is we just don't know what's going to happen. But hopefully we'll never be back the way we were this time last year.
Yeah, let's hope so. And finally, then, an additional ferry service has been chartered for the Stornoway Ullapool link. A short-term charter has been agreed for the MV Arrow to provide additional services on the Stornoway Ullapool ferry route. The vessel will operate a number of overnight freight sailings, allowing the MV Loch Seaforth to provide additional passenger sailings at busy times over the peak summer period. The MV Arrow completed berthing trials over the weekend, and CalMac will confirm details of its deployment shortly. Minister for Transport Graham Day said the charter of the MV Arrow means we will see more services between Stornoway and Ullapool as we look to help Lewis and Harris emerge from the COVID pandemic. It will bring additional capacity to this key route during the busy summer period by allowing CalMac to free up the Loch Seaforth to let more passengers and their vehicles travel. It will also increase freight capacity. This is a good news story, isn't it? Let's hope it's a good news story, and that there's not an increase of Delta variant cases that travel around. But we're assuming this is a good news story. Often, the Scottish Government can be accused of being perhaps a little too central belt focused. So this is good that they're moving their attentions out to much needed services in the Highlands and Islands, isn't it?
Absolutely, and proud to say that Graham is my Graham Day is my MSP, and I campaigned for him for the election. I know Graham, and he's meticulous, and he's a grafter, and he gets the job done, and that's certainly my impression of him. And so it's a good testimony, I think. I knew he would be good at as transport, actually, because he's got that eye for detail. But yes, it is, especially at a time when we're all kind of holidaying at home. I hate that word staycation, so I'm not going to say it, but we're all holidaying at home. Everybody's thinking about Scotland as a destination, and there's some beautiful places in Scotland, and so allowing Harris and so forth to get a bit more of that, and actually interestingly as well to allow a bit more freight. So better transport of goods and so forth as well. It feels exactly what you were saying. It feels that we're not cutting the islands off, we're beginning to reconnect back with them from the mainland. And that is really important, I think, especially at a time where we've all been through quite a lot. And the communities must have felt quite isolated up there because of COVID and the restrictions that we had. So yeah, it is a good news story. And I would love to go. I think I was going to go at one point, and then we ended up cancelling last minute. But I'd love to go to Harris, so you never know.
Absolutely, I'd love to go to Lewis or Harris. Both would be good.
Yeah,
We were just back from.
We could do both.
Yeah, we're just back from our own short staycation in Edinburgh and St Andrews on the eastern side. It was absolutely lovely. Yeah, Scotland's a wonderful place to visit and to live.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Siobhan Toland, for that this evening. We have come towards the end of our programme. We can only do what we do here at Broadcasters Scotland thanks to your generous support and your donations. So if you can, please sign up on the website and give a little bit if you can in any way afford it, to allow us to continue to do the work that we do, which is not beholden to any government or commercial interests. Thank you very much, and good night.